A young woman rubbed her half-open eyes, the bags under them seemingly heavy enough to pull down her mood. Her waist-length raven hair frizzed out due to the relative humidity, all thanks to the nearby marshes, which irritated her nose enough to elicit a less than delicate sneeze. Groggily shaking away the irritation, she rubbed her bright violet eyes thoroughly and straightened her hair the best she could without a brush, her thin, pale frame shrouded by her lengthy nightgown. Her pointed ears twitched slightly at the creaking floorboards beneath her, betraying her heritage as a Drocht, one of a handful of races living alongside mankind. With a hefty yawn, she stretched her limbs, hobbling to the kitchen counter. After coughing lightly and flicking her fingers, a small burst of violet flames ignited atop Olga's index, illuminating her surroundings in a purple haze. She guided her finger next to a small gas burner, built for cooking while camping, and gently turned the dial with her free hand. The violet flames jumped to the gas nearly instantaneously and brought the makeshift stovetop to life, the plum-colored wisps shifting to the typical red-orange of a normal fire, as the chroma within the original spark was gradually distributed into the surrounding area. Olga adjusted her gown and picked up a nearby coffee pot, shuffling over to the water pump nestled just outside the mobile home she resided in. The sun's rays were dappling the yard in a light golden glow through the dozen or so trees lining the site. As she filled up at the pump outside, eyes still adjusting to the bright daylight, the woman lazily rang the bell in the middle of the campsite. The daily signal to rise and shine shattered the crew's pleasant sleep, urging them to their feet. After returning to the confines of her tidy lodging and grabbing a large canister of instant coffee, she dumped a hefty portion of the grounds into the pot and put it onto the heat, ensuring to stir it well as the burner brought the beverage up to the perfect temperature. During this interval, Olga could hear lots of shuffling and commotion outside, telling her that everyone had heard the bell. At least she could sit for a while this morning before adding to the daily preparations, having purposely gotten up half an hour early for extra time to fully awaken. She was not, by any account, a morning person. Looking at the pot she set down in front of her and wishing she had some milk or sugar, anything to cut the bitterness, Olga scratched the back of her neck before pouring herself a generous cup. It may not have tasted very good, but at least it sped the process of waking up along. Deciding it would be best to relax in her shop to be, she shuffled over to a building in the far distance with a two-faced sign sporting the title of Evangelion Bookstores, your one-stop shop for all things literary. She sipped on the coffee while she trudged along, every drink causing her face to mildly contort from the strong taste, before gently resting into a tired haze yet again. Once she finally arrived at the door, Olga reached lazily for the doorknob. However, all she felt was air. Mildly perturbed, she swiped nonchalantly at the open space, leaning further and further forward until she realized that the door was already open. A sudden and severe clench overtook her gut, muscles constricting tightly. The doorknob was half ripped out and the hinges appeared rickety and bent. Olga set her coffee down on top of the front desk, slowly stepping inside and triggering the silent alarm underneath her main seat, her mind racing her heart in a competition of panic. Knowing it would be a matter of minutes before one of the guards showed up, she felt far safer exploring the building to find the culprit behind all of the misdeeds, considering someone far better with damage control than her would be arriving soon. The air around her hung thick with chroma, almost as though it were meeting her beck and call, which brought mild comfort to her. Glancing behind her, she noticed a couple of fellow clerks jog into her establishment before any guard could get there. A stout human named Orville stopped dead in his tracks and cursed under his breath. His rotund fingers traced the woodworking, following the warped and splintered wood along the door frame, eyes darting wildly across the scene.
"What in all that's holy happened here?"
he muttered. He looked up to the taller human, who accompanied him, gesturing him inside.
"Make sure Olga is all right. Will you, Grim?"
With a silent nod, Grim shuffled into the building, glancing back at the door before inspecting Olga thoroughly.
"You're all right, are you not?"
he murmured. His dull Caucasian skin contrasted greatly with his raven black hair, his eyes sunken in far more than any other Olga had seen. His posture was horrid, but he kept himself quite tidy, shown by the black and white suit he had adorned himself with. Even in an emergency, it seemed that Grim was organized.
Yes, I'm fine,
muttered Olga, more concerned with the door than herself. As Grim was about to say something else, Orville interrupted, clearing his throat.
Say, this was very clearly busted open from the handle. Almost like someone tried to open the door without turning it. Not to mention, this is a pull door from the outside. I'll trace any tracks I can find.
Pointing at his partner, the stout merchant added,
Keep her safe, Grim.
Yeah.
Grim scoffed as Orville summoned up a healthy dose of chroma into the shape of a lens, magnifying his sightline significantly. Remembering something, the shorter man fully turned to face Grim.
Say, is your chroma back to normal? I know you drained a lot of it the other day during that attempted burglary. I want to be sure you can still use magic, if you need to.
Yes, it is. Thank you. You know how it goes. If you've got a tad left, it all comes back eventually. Now stop fretting over me and go track down whoever did this.
With a dismissing handwave from his taller ally, Orville sighed and began tracing anything he could spot. Grim turned to Olga yet again, once the former was out of earshot.
So something busted in. Don't suppose you saw it, did you?
No, I really didn't.
Replied Olga with mild frustration.
I came over here and the door was just bent inwards, busted right open. I'd rather not dive into this head first, especially if whoever did it is still here.
Well, guess we gotta start out with taking inventory. We should go from top to...
All of a sudden, the duo's attention snapped towards a distant bookshelf, where a relatively large book was visibly grabbed away, and a similarly thick book claimed the first one's spot. The shopkeepers looked at each other before Olga's hands ignited in small violet flames. Grim's hands grew long, spindly fingers with dangerously sharp talons at the ends. Pitch black smoke soon began hissing off of them, the darkness making up the hands crawling up beneath his sleeves. As soon as their magics were triggered, a yelp could be heard from behind the bookshelf, whoever was there still being hidden from view. This made Grim step back, but Olga kept creeping forward. At this point, the tightness grasping her gut had let up, replaced with a flaming wave. Jaw clenched, arms outstretched, and eyes blazing, she strutted forward, glaring down the area she'd heard the sound escape from. Then, the bookshelf before Olga began to ever so slightly tilt towards her. The creaking of wood struggling under its own weight resounded through the room, its movement causing the air around it to shift violently. Olga knelt down, rapidly analyzing her surroundings, before clenching her hands to her chest and tumbling towards the walkway. She felt a sharp pain in her left arm as wood barely scraped along flesh, the deafening crack making her flinch. Grim immediately rushed over to help her up, but he was promptly waved away. Olga, exasperated, scanned the room cautiously. There were a handful of books strewn upon the ground, but otherwise the only mess was the bookshelf, though there wasn't any sign of anybody here who could have pushed it down. Tilting her head, Olga snuck ever closer to the spot, reading the spines of the books sprawled before her.
Family bonds and how to form them. Chroma and you, an in-depth guide. Cassie, the small blue cat. An analysis of the respiratory system. What in the...
All too suddenly, she saw a flash of movement out of the corner of her eye. Whipping around to face the source, she spotted a brief blur of something bolting behind another bookshelf. She squinted her eyes, trying to tilt her head to peer around the corner and spot whatever this thing was, when a booming voice, all too familiar, nearly made her jump out of her skin and caused a scream to escape Grim's lips.
Olga, you in here?
Yes, Braun. I'm right here.
sighed Olga, breathing slightly heavily with a hand placed over her collarbone. Grim simply walked out of the shop in agitation.
You really don't need to be quite so loud.
My apologies.
Chuckled Braun, cheeks rosy as ever. His body was sculpted and honed over a couple decades of intense training and heavy-duty work, greenish-tan skin glistening in the sun. His red-orange eyes glittered with excitement at seeing Olga, his tight-fitting work shirt and jeans barely containing his muscles. His tool belt was stocked full of defensive tools, from batons to tasers to a couple of flashbangs. Having overlooked construction as a guard for several years, Braun knew what he'd need in any scenario and made sure to have it prepared. Perhaps the most noticeable tool at his disposal, however, was the massive pair of gauntlets dangling from his side. They were a deep, dark brown with black and gold lacing tying them together. They had every sort of bruise imaginable, from scorch marks to acid burns, sewn together tears, gashes, and everything in between. The mutant man always wore a broad grin, though his comforting smile had grown significantly less welcome for Olga as of late, due to one simple, yet highly irritating reason.
Oh, why couldn't they send someone who wouldn't try to hit on me? Oh, nothing. Just, help me grab this guy, okay? He's right over...
As Olga was about to point to where she saw the blur go to, it bolted right towards her and Braun, warranting a yelp from the former. The guard just braced himself for impact. But it never came. The two looked at each other before hearing a shattering sound and whipping around to see a window busted wide open, a thin trail of blood spatters detailing the direction the intruder went. Olga stiffened her resolve, gracefully leaping out the window after it, while Braun took the door and followed close behind. This individual was damn fast, but the pair behind it were able to keep up, more or less. After a decent distance, Olga decided she'd had enough. She focused on her breathing while she ran, pushing and willing the energy lingering within her into the palm of her hand. Suddenly, Braun's head whipped around to face her, eyes wide and face illuminated with a violet glow. A fireball resided in her hand, the size of his head, and she let out a hefty scream as she hurled the projectile in a beautiful arc, trailing wisps of purple flame behind it, which erupted into an explosion directly in front of the person they were chasing. It was only then that she realized what exactly it was. The short, slightly pudgy being was treated like a rag doll by the force of the impact, tumbling back into its pursuers. It sported a pair of underbitten incisors, eyes solid and gleaming navy blue, no irises or whites to be seen in them. It wore simple rags, which were now relatively more ragged thanks to Olga's intervention, and it scrambled to find its footing. A sudden and immense gut-twisting caused Olga to freeze, her senses feeling heightened. This wasn't a person. This was a magical entity, a monster. This was a peck! But something was wrong. Just as soon as the clenching had incapacitated her, it let her go with her mind carefully analyzing the entity before her. Its limbs were longer than they should have been. A deformity would be a good explanation, but deformities couldn't make them just as functional as they were normally. Her confusion grew as the beast before them looked up at her, directly in the eyes. In them, Olga saw something she could not explain. Where primal emotions and animalistic intent should reside, she saw something more. A spark, a light she'd never considered could exist in an animal. It seemed like she was looking into the eyes of another person, and for just a moment, she felt her throat clench as her eyes got hot. She saw, for a brief instant, something in those eyes she could connect with, which shook her to her core. This thing was trembling and whimpering, clenching its teeth in vain as they clattered together. Perhaps the most jarring portion for her, though, was something she'd never in her life seen an animal do before. The thing wasn't growling or biting, it wasn't trying to attack her or even run away. The peck was simply sitting down, crying.